all for being here today. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Yarimar Bonilla to FSU as one of our keynote speakers for this conference on disasters in the 21st century Circum-Caribbean. Dr. Bonilla, who is a professor in the Department of Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino Studies at Hunter College, as well as the PhD program in anthropology at the CUNY Graduate Center, is the author of work that spans the Caribbean region, starting with her first book, Non-Sovereign Futures, French Caribbean Politics in the Wake of Disenchantment in 2015. This work, which is based on a beautiful ethnography of the 2009 labor strikes in Guadeloupe, opens out to offer a compelling approach to comparing Caribbean islands along a sovereignty spectrum, as opposed to a divide between independent and still colonial nations. This reframing of coloniality, and therefore how islands of different political statuses can approach decolonial projects in solidarity, has been incredibly generative to me and the many classes with whom I've read it. Her current research, for which she was named a 2018 to 2020 Carnegie Fellow, examines the politics of recovery in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria and the forms of political and social trauma that the storm revealed. Her most recent publications are offshoots of this research. In 2019, The Aftershocks of Disaster, Puerto Rico Before and After the Storm, which she co-edited with Marisol Lebrun, was published with Haymarket Books. It provides a multidisciplinary scope of how Hurricane Maria exacerbated the questions of coloniality that were already strangling Puerto Rico since the dead. It is, in this regard, a companion piece to the PR syllabus, the website that she and Lebrun, among others, spearheaded to serve as a public resource about Puerto Rico and the dead. This set of projects demonstrates the ways in which Dr. Bonilla has charted a path for herself as a public intellectual, committed to speaking and teaching in a variety of venues and registers. She writes a monthly column in the Puerto Rican newspaper El Nuevo Dia entitled El Vaivén, Coming and Going, and is a regular contributor to news sources including the Washington Post, the New Yorker, and Democracy Now! She'll be speaking today on post-disaster futures, Caribbean politics in the wake. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Yarimar Bonilla.
Thank you, everyone. I wanted to start, before talking about Puerto Rico, by first just saying how meaningful it is for me to be here at this conference that is in part commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Haitian earthquake. For me, the Haitian earthquake was such a pivotal moment in my thinking and in my development as a scholar. When it happened, I was a young assistant professor at the University of Virginia, and I was very impacted by the events. I lost my research assistant to the earthquake at the time, and that was such a space of mourning for me. And I was also going through personal mourning from the loss of my father. And so that year at UVA, we had a whole host of events, and a lot of folks in this room, such as Edouard and Mark, came for different activities that we did then. And I have to say that all of that really shaped my understanding of disasters. I had no way of knowing that it would prepare me for now thinking about the challenges in Puerto Rico. As Jeanine said, I recently edited a book called Aftershocks of Disaster, and now that Puerto Rico has been going through earthquakes, a lot of folks have asked me, are you a bruja? Like, how did you know? How did you know that Puerto Rico is going to go through earthquakes? I always say, no, I'm not a bruja, I'm just a good Caribbeanist who has been thinking, with the region and particularly with Haiti for a long time. And so while many of my colleagues in anthropology come to the study of disasters through social science literature or through fields like disaster management, for me it's really through Haitian studies that I came to my understandings about disaster. And it is from the perspective of Haiti that I've come to develop my understandings of produced vulnerability, of the kind that Laura was talking about this morning, issues of disaster capitalism, which I didn't learn from Naomi Klein, I learned from Caribbeanists, disaster philanthropy, the NGO industrial complex, the racial logics of discourses of resilience, the political work of the language of crisis itself, and the cruel optimism of claims of building back better. All of which are things that I have learned through thinking about Haiti and the rest of the Caribbean, and that we can see very much unfolding now in the wake of these very important and in some ways historic hurricanes that have rolled through Puerto Rico and through other parts of the Caribbean as well. So I think it's important to notice how Haiti and the scholarship that has emerged out of Haitian studies continues to orient us and give us conceptual tools for thinking about politics in the Caribbean. And in many ways, Haiti continues to be a political vanguard. And I say this not in any kind of romantic sense, but really in the literal sense of charging first into the fires of the environmental, political, and economic challenges that face the region as a whole. For a long time, Haiti has been a touch point for me for thinking about issues of constrained sovereignty, and it has now become an important site from which to think about the impossibilities of recovery. As Laura was saying earlier today, you know, that there's a sense that the disaster will never end, right? When did it begin? When did it end? But there's also this idea, I was so struck by when she said that folks say Haiti can't catch a break, because I've been literally fielding that question from journalists about Puerto Rico, where it says, it seems like Puerto Rico can't catch a break. It's not really about luck, right? This isn't about playing the wrong number in the lotto. So I think that in many ways this conference is a testament to the importance of comparative work and of thinking broadly across the Caribbean, and I think this becomes ever more urgent in the context of increasing climate catastrophe and the inescapable nature of the repeating disasters that face the Caribbean. So again, Haiti offers us very important lessons, so in that sense, although I am here to speak, I'm also very much here to learn. So the paper I want to share with you today is a work in progress, but sometimes those make the best presentations, right? Because it's still not all wrapped up. And it is for a special issue that will be coming out soon of Small Acts that was based on a conference that we recently held in New York with my colleagues David Scott and Ryan Jobson. We convened this conference that tried to situate climate change alongside the crisis of the post-colonial state in the Caribbean, and in particularly the exhaustion of the project of post-colonial sovereignty. And part of what we were trying to think through together in that space, both the conveners and those who attended, was how the question of the non-sovereign impasse, which those of you who are familiar with David Scott's work will know, you know, the way he talks about the kind of arrested post-colonial present of the Caribbean, how this extends beyond the nominally independent Caribbean to the non-sovereign Caribbean as well, which is something that I've written about before. Our principal objective was to forge an innovative conceptual vocabulary, I'm citing the introduction here, at a moment in which our modes of analysis are likewise exhausted by looming existential threats. In the introduction to the special series, Ryan Jobson writes that beyond its status as the proverbial canary in the coal mine, the Caribbean is a measure of the limits of liberal universalism and the category of the human it purports to defend. Will the survival of humanity once again rest on the backs of the innumerable Caribbean dead? Or will the changing climate occasion a turn to the Caribbean as a staging ground for a radical humanism unencumbered by the colonial logic of sovereignty that endures under synthetic flags of convenience? In the issue, we place the crisis of climate alongside the crisis of governance, such as forms of state violence levied against the community of Tivoli Gardens in Jamaica in 2011, states of emergency declared to combat drug gangs in Trinidad and Tobago, the Ricky Renuncia protest that ousted the governor of Puerto Rico this past summer, and the continued violence against Haitian civilians following the termination of gas subsidies and the laundering of development funds from the Petro-Caribe Accord with Venezuela. In doing so, we direct our inquiry towards the limits of the post-colonial state and the prescriptive ideal of national independence in regional efforts to mitigate the climatological excess of global petrocapitalism. Now, so that's the kind of issue as a whole. My contribution to the issue, which I want to share and get your feedback on today, is trying to think about how we can imagine the current crisis in Puerto Rico alongside this larger crisis of post-colonial governance in the Caribbean. So I begin my piece by examining the very meaning of the term disaster in Puerto Rico and beyond. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary defines disaster as both an event or fact that has unfortunate consequences, as well as a person or thing that is a complete failure. And I'm sure many of us know people who are complete disasters, right? So I argue that perhaps this double meaning explains why, in the wake of two back-to-back hurricanes slicing through the island of Puerto Rico, residents might respond to these events by producing graffiti that states, "El desastre es la colonia," the disaster is the colony. The slogan suggests that the true catastrophe in contemporary Puerto Rico is not the arrival of hurricanes and earthquakes, but the slowly occurring effects of racial colonial governance. Since Hurricane Maria, I have been trying to think and write about how Maria ripped the veil off of Puerto Rico's colonial status, both for those observing from afar who had perhaps never stopped to contemplate what Puerto Rico's relationship to the United States entailed, as well as for local residents who were forced into what I describe as an affective reckoning with the kinds of structural violence that they had been enduring for decades. Given all this, my focus has thus been not on what Hurricane Maria caused, something which I think will take years to become fully apparent, but rather on what it revealed, namely how it laid bare the forms of structural violence and racial colonial logics that had been operating in Puerto Rico for centuries. Now, in my comments today, I'm interested in thinking about the kinds of political life that can emerge in the wake of a post-colonial disaster. And again, by disaster, I mean not just an event of unfortunate consequences, but also a failure, specifically the failure of decolonization. Puerto Rico is often imagined as an exception to the history of decolonization in the region, since it did not obtain flag independence. In other writings, I have questioned the exceptionality that surrounds places like Puerto Rico in the non-sovereign Caribbean by thinking about how all Caribbean societies suffer from forms of constrained or limited sovereignty. In this paper, I want to examine how Puerto Rico is currently undergoing a political crisis that also echoes the kinds of political disenchantment discernible in other parts of the Caribbean. I argue that throughout the region, the promises of decolonization resulted in debt economies, displaced diasporas, and shattered hopes for the future. The fact is that in contemporary Puerto Rico, much of what looks like the product of a devastating hurricane is actually the result of a failed post-colonial experiment. Long before Maria, the Puerto Rican landscape was already dominated by signs of ruin: bankruptcy, default, foreclosure, displacement, dispossession, exile, decay, and neglect. This is why at present you will find more signs, slogans, and hashtags denouncing colonialism and the debt than you will finding those denouncing the inefficiencies of FEMA. It is also why you will find signs placed on crumbling infrastructure clarifying that this was not caused by Maria. In this paper, I wish to examine how contemporary Puerto Ricans are navigating not only the material ruins of a hurricane-ravaged society, but also what Ann Stoler and others call the imperial debris of a failed colonial and post-colonial experiment. Building on the work of writers such as David Scott and Stoler, I'm interested in the problem space of post-colonial disaster, a site of ruin that is no longer guided by the promises of a better colonial future or the anticipation of a positive promise of sovereignty on the horizon. I thus ask, what visions of the future can emerge out of this context of catastrophic sedimentation? What does post-disaster politics look like? When we are imagining the post here as not just singling an end, but an ongoing relationship. But before getting to the future, let me take a step back and make a case for thinking about Puerto Rico as a site of post-colonial failure. As most of you know in this room, since its acquisition by the United States, Puerto Rico has served as a site of experimentation, broadly speaking. Everything from birth control and sterilization procedures to deadly pesticides and military weaponry have been tested and refined on Puerto Rican soil. Experiments have been conducted on its land and its people, but also, though less discussed, on its forms of governance. From the moment of its non-incorporation into the Federation of U.S. states as a territory that belongs to, but is not a part of, the United States, Puerto Rico served as a site from which to test the limits of stratified inclusion, structural violence, racial governance, and constrained decolonization. In 1952, the island's status, locally referred to as the ELA, an acronym for Estado Libre Asociado, was developed as a way of meeting the rising calls for self-determination around the globe. The status was glossed in English as Commonwealth, an empty phrase that served as a cloak for ongoing colonial status. At the moment of its founding, the ELA was described as a bilateral pact that would grant Puerto Rico a certain measure of self-governance, while remaining in association with the United States. Although often viewed as a unique relationship, you might have heard that Puerto Rico is often referenced as the last colony, the oldest colony, etc. These developments were formation of part of the larger non-sovereign Caribbean. And this is a map that I worked on. If you Google visualizing sovereignty, you can see this project where I tried this. It's a temporal map where Caribbean societies are placed in the order in which they have their contemporary political status. And here you can see that Puerto Rico is right in the middle of all of this experimentation. Around the same time of the establishment of the ELA, both the Dutch and the French Antilles were engaging in similar forms of non-sovereign incorporation to their metropolises, while in the British Caribbean, the West Indies Federation and later the Commonwealth of Nations were taking shape. Meanwhile, in what are now independent nations, forms of decolonization were forged that allowed for what one might call flag independence, while severely limiting economic and other forms of sovereignty. Residents of both independent nations and of the Commonwealth, departments, and other post-colonial experiments in the Caribbean were thus promised a bright future by both local politicians and imperial governments. Throughout the region, modernism, development, and economic growth appeared guaranteed on the horizon. Indeed, a tourism ad for Puerto Rico, created in the 1970s, went as far as describing Puerto Rico as Progress Island. And this is on YouTube, and I highly recommend watching it, out of pure sadistic pleasure. So throughout the region, modernism, development, and economic growth were touted as the promised results of decolonization. However, and this is Time magazine celebrating Puerto Rico's first elected governor who's going to bring all this experimentation, democracy's laboratory, to the Americas. However, as with decolonizing projects throughout the region, those promises soon began to fade. In the first decades following the formation of the ELA, Puerto Rico experienced rapid industrialization and economic progress, benefiting greatly from the post-war New Deals and various tax incentives that lured American manufacturing to the island. These results were celebrated as exemplars of US-led capitalist development, and Puerto Rico is showcased as an alternative to the development of left-wing politics in other parts of the region. However, as early as the 1970s, as the global economy experienced significant shocks due to rising oil prices, it was already becoming clear that the policies implemented were not leading to true self-sustained growth. By the 1990s, when the Clinton administration removed tax incentives that had once lured manufacturing industries to the island, Puerto Rico's economy began its historic downturn. As a result, local administrators turned to heavy borrowing, with direct assistance from Wall Street to compensate and mask a deflated economic base. By 2015, Puerto Rico's governor declared that the territory was at the risk of descending into what economists describe as a financial death spiral. For many, this was just a confirmation of the looming sense of doom that had already presided over the society for decades. Following the governor's declaration that Puerto Rico's debt was unpayable, the federal government denied the island the right to declare bankruptcy. Instead, the government passed what is known as the Promesa Law, the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, which allowed for the imposition of an undemocratically appointed fiscal control board to manage the island's finances, in what for many represented the return to a previous era of overt colonial rule. Due to these processes, the contemporary debt crisis made clear what many had long known, that the Commonwealth status created in 1952 had been a mere facade for an enduring colonial condition. During this period, many began to talk about the death of the era, or the death of the Commonwealth. This was accompanied by staged funeral processions, the display of Puerto Rican flags recast in black and white, and performative mortuary rites. In addition to these kind of local assertions of the death of the Commonwealth, on the side of the United States, there was also a reversal in the official position of the government, which began to backpedal during legislative hearings and say that no, in fact, Puerto Ricans were never really given sovereignty. It was something akin to sovereignty, but not really sovereignty. Now, so this political death, this end of the promise that the ELA had been a kind of decolonization, was in turn followed by the imposition of severe economic measures by both the fiscal board and the local government, when what has increasingly come to be understood as a political experiment in new forms of austerity governance. Puerto Rico has thus now shifted from being a laboratory of modernist development to becoming an experimental site of neoliberal austerity management. Indeed, several of the fiscal board members have openly expressed this and made clear that they are seeking new and creative ways of managing the territory, which could then be exported elsewhere. Now, this austerity regime has produced an even greater landscape of ruin. Shuttered elementary schools, a gutted public university, a defunded health system, crumbling infrastructure, and a migratory crisis that has generated the increasing feeling of an emptying island. In response to the migratory crisis, a slick marketing campaign was developed which implored residents to keep their chins up and to not quit, i.e. no quitarse, or no se quiten. It sought to promote toughing it out, not quitting, and instead enduring, facing head-on the mechanisms of slow violence that austerity implies. Many interpreted this slogan as a jab on those who have migrated, but the fact is that those who have left have also had much to endure as they confront the naked racism of the United States under the Trump regime. Many I've interviewed in the diaspora have spoken about the challenges they face as they are suddenly berated aggressively for speaking Spanish in public, while also having to manage the new effective terrain of exile. And in the midst of all this, Maria arrived. Amidst what was already a landscape of ruin, this Category 5 storm led to the deadliest disaster in modern U.S. history, producing more casualties than 9/11. The deaths, however, were not caused by the winds and rains of the storm, but by the infrastructural aftershocks that followed, which were themselves a product of Puerto Rico's century-long colonial experiment. In fact, it has been little noted that Maria arrived precisely around the 100th anniversary of U.S. citizenship to the Puerto Ricans. With the declaration of the debt crisis, the limits of Puerto Rico's colonial condition became undeniable. With the declaration of the financial death spiral, Puerto Ricans have had to contend with a future that heralds greater austerity and social decay. The university is under threat of losing its accreditation due to drastic budget cuts. The governor threatened to reduce funding for the hospital system. The Department of Education has been shutting down schools and pushing towards a charter system modeled on post-Katrina New Orleans. And now hurricane recovery plans are feared to lead to even greater displacement as communities face the threat of being forcibly relocated from newly declared zones of environmental vulnerability. This is a map created by local activists, Ayuda Legal, that are mapping out the ways in which Puerto Rico is being turned into an opportunity zone and creating new forms of displacement. At present, 98% of the Puerto Rican territory has been declared an opportunity zone for foreign investment. Privatization, profiteering, and dispossession loom on the horizon, and this is only accelerating in the wake of the earthquakes. Political life in Puerto Rico must thus contend with both a contemporary landscape marked by the ruins of a previous colonial experiment and a future horizon that only heralds further social decay. Well, part of what I am interested in thinking about is how this requires a new political orientation that breaks with modernist assumptions of a better future. And this phrase, "se acabaron las promesas," is the promises are over, is a slogan that has been used by activists to react to the imposition of the promesa law. But I feel like it evokes something much larger about the end of the modernist promise of decolonization and progress for the island. The Italian philosopher Franco Berardi refers to this process of breaking with modernist future as the slow cancellation of the future, which he describes as the increasing lack of faith in the modernist mythology of linear development and increasing prosperity. Mark Fisher describes this as a feeling of belatedness, of having arrived after the gold rush. However, in the case of the Caribbean, this feeling is not that of a future superseded, but more precisely of a future foreclosed. As the slogan "Se acabaron las promesas" suggests, what Puerto Ricans face at the present is not the end of a political project, but rather the end of its promise. That is, Puerto Ricans must now contend with the idea of losing something they never really obtained. Again, I'm interested in thinking about how this current moment requires a political stance that is centered not in what Laurent Berlant describes as a cruel optimism, which lulls one into a continued faith in liberal democratic promises of what is to come, but rather on a particular form of pessimism, a belief that things are awful and not necessarily going to be repaired. Indeed, many believe that in Puerto Rico there will be no recovery, particularly if by recovery we mean to a return to a faith in the promises of the era. Of course, the question then becomes, to echo Benjamin, how exactly does one organize pessimism? How can we live and act politically in the absence of faith in a better future? How can we develop not a cruel optimism that blinds us to what is to come, but rather a hopeful pessimism that can serve to build politically in the face of ruin and the promise of further decay? These questions seem imperative in an era of climatic crisis, when we know with certainty that natural disasters are on the rise, as well as in an era of post-colonial crisis, where the promises of decolonization have been extinguished. The Puerto Rican historian and activist Rafael Bernabe has argued that hope can actually be nurtured by pessimism. Following Terry Eagleton, Bernabe calls for hope without optimism. That is, a faith in political action, even in the midst of great uncertainty regarding where that action might ultimately lead. I believe this kind of hopeful pessimism might be what is needed to move beyond what David Scott has described as our arrested post-colonial present, or what I've previously described as the wake of disenchantment. An era in which the political models of the past have lost their perches, but new political forms, vocabularies, and imaginaries are yet to emerge. In other words, perhaps pessimism is what we need to move beyond nostalgic immobility. So in the final part of the paper, which is still coming together, what I want to do is to think about how young activists in Puerto Rico are imagining what politics could look like and signify in the midst of disaster and ruin. How are they constructing a post-disaster future? Again, understanding disaster as something without beginning or end. How can we move politically from here? How can we imagine a future outside of a modernist telos of nationalist progress and post-colonial sovereignty? For this, I'm looking at the political forms that have emerged after the earthquake in Puerto Rico, after the hurricane, but also after the summer revolution of 2019. As I'm sure many of you know, this past summer, thousands gathered in Puerto Rico to protest the actions and the statements made by the local governor, and in less than 2 weeks, they had actually managed to get him to resign. This has been described as la revolución de la generación del no me dejo, the revolution of the generation of, and no me dejo is like I won't be messed with or something. And I'm struck in part by this slogan, they took so much away from us that they even took our fear. So part of what characterizes this generation is the idea of loss, of scarcity, of precarity, and of not having a hope in this kind of modernist future. In the longer paper, I examined the work of Ariana Bigio, who runs a weblog called Consentimiento, which means with sentiment, but also with consent. As Ariana Bigio explains, her generation is one that has been born into crisis. She says, I don't remember ever since I was a kid living in a period not characterized by crisis. In a recently penned reflection, she writes, we have inherited a debt that we did not create, and we live carrying a weight that should not be our responsibility. We do not rest because of the anxiety of what will or will not be our future. She goes on, we resent the country left to us by previous generations and the scarce opportunities for progress that we have. Sorry, this is her in the glasses. We work for miserable wages that are not enough to live on. We go to a university that is less accessible every day. We prepare to enter a violent work environment that does not reward the preparation that we have. To become professionals, we have to borrow heavily and be slaves to absurd loans. The health system has failed us and keeps many in constant uncertainty. We are a generation that does not know the luxuries of having a good economy. We did not live the years of prosperity. And for this and so many other reasons, we have nothing to lose. I want to think more critically about this idea of which was the generation that had this luxury of a good economy, because Puerto Rico never had a good economy, but it had this kind of misguided faith and belief that it did. And I recognize that even for my generation, when I graduated university, I thought I would just go get really quick a degree in the US and come back and have a job waiting for me. That was a misguided idea, but the current generation doesn't even have that naivete. But it's interesting that for Aliana, the idea of risking it all, of having nothing to lose, doesn't imply a leap into the unknown or into the diaspora, but actually daring to stay, daring to redefine what it means to endure on the island. She says, "We have been warned that if we want a better future, we will have to get it out there and allá afuera. We don't want to leave. We want to create a better future here." However, Aliana and others like her want to redefine what it means to stay home and engage in political action from within. Others I've interviewed have echoed this sentiment. They see the political projects of previous generations, which centered around a search for decolonization through either statehood or independence, as ways of being held hostage by the decolonial future. They see previous generations as having put their futures on hold for the sake of the promise of decolonization, turning a blind eye to problems of corruption, misogyny, homophobia, and discrimination in the hope of solving these in a future decolonial Puerto Rico. Contemporary activists say that they will no longer put governance on hold for the sake of decolonization. As Aliana explains, we will no longer turn a blind eye. We will remind the country what democracy is and what it looks like in practice. And part of what was interesting about the Riqui Renuncia movement was that it involved not just a turn away from the traditional formulas of decolonization, but also a turn away from the traditional subjects of politics. Throughout, there were different characters that participated in the revolution. Everything from motorcycle brigades that involved folks from the housing projects, and I put here a clip from them on the news because many people said that it was the first time they had seen such people on the national news. Also, young women who have also not been seen as the protagonists of struggle, right? There's this idea of it being, big men that lead political movements, and it was very much young women who were on the battleground. And these young people here who I took a picture of at a protest, they had one of the slogans that became centered to the movement, which is "Somos más," there's more of us, and we're not afraid, no tenemos miedo. And they divvied up the slogan among these different flags. And so they said that for them, the black and white flag, which had emerged in the context of the debt crisis, but they said that it represented the mourning of the dead of Maria. I think it represents a kind of mourning in general, right, of the lost dreams, of the dead, of the economic crisis and the political crisis. They said the regular red and blue flag represented history, culture, and tradition, and then the queer Puerto Rican flag, which was very present in the protests, to them was evoked in this idea of somos más. We're inclusive. Our movement is not the movement of a kind of divisive nationalist project that centers on respectability and on policing folk forms of culture and sexuality. I want to show just a little clip. I had to show some perreo combativo. So this was, for those that don't know, this was an event that happened in the middle of the revolution where there was this, oh, you can't see it. I can see it. I can see because I have the PowerPoint. Oh, here it is. protest that was held in front of the cathedral and that caused a lot of scandal because it was lascivious, queer bodies and bringing down the government through their gyrations. And it worked. And I want to show one more. And for this one, the subtitles are very important. That's like mirroring and very difficult to navigate. Very from Instagram. So that's kind of where I end because I'm still writing this, but I'm trying to think about what this political future can look like in the wake of disaster where you know this idea that they've taken everything from us. They've taken the fear, they've taken our respectability politics and our fear of risking everything. So I'm still trying to think about how this also involves losing the fear of a kind of queer failure of nation too, where there's like certain risks that can be taken when you're understanding that you're inventing these political relationships completely new. So that's what happened.